I think our frustration with the whole process, and particularly the inquiry since Grenfell, is the amount of time it's taken and the very, very slow pace of change, and whether that change is going to be significant enough to address the real issues. So, it's 5 years since that worst domestic fire in living memory and the horrific scenes that we saw that night. And yet, for firefighters, and I think for many people in the community as well, and for people living in blocks of flats around the country, very little has changed.
Has part of that frustration been the fact that much of the inquiry is focused on what happened on the actual evening, which, of course, those pictures and those awful things which everybody remembers, rather than the issues in the build-up which led to what we saw on that night?
I think that's precisely the point. And nobody's trying to shy away from examining every aspect of what happened. And I think firefighters were very frank and open in giving their evidence at the inquiry. But there was a huge focus on that. But the point is this, that Grenfell Tower happened, the fire happened in the way it did, spread in the way it did, because the safety measures which should be in place in a building were not in place. The building had most obviously been wrapped in flammable cladding. And the question for us is, how can that even happen in one of the richest countries in the world, that we turn buildings into such a disaster zone where something like that can happen? And that's the point that's been missed, that there have been, there's lots of evidence that's come to light during the inquiry on those points, but the focus, because of the length of time, the focus was on the early stages. And we said from the start that we thought the inquiry was somewhat back to front as a result.
You mentioned earlier that you feel there's been a lack of change. Are you really still concerned that there's going to be another problem, another night like Grenfell, if things don't dramatically change?
We're certainly not predicting exactly the same thing. Things don't tend to happen like that. But the point is this, that there were warning signs in the UK and around the world about the risks, for example, of flammable cladding. Indeed, my own organisation made those warnings in the House of Commons 20 years before Grenfell, and those warnings were ignored. And so we know that there are still buildings with flammable cladding, but there are buildings with a whole host of other fire safety failures, and the authorities, particularly central government, are very, very slow to address the issues that have been raised by the inquiry and exposed by the inquiry.
Thanks for talking to us. That's Wrack from the Fire Brigades Union.